host, Joe Hero, and in this session we're going to explore Chapter 3 of Bud Hopkins' book, Missing Time. The time here regarding this particular incident is 1978, and Ted Blecker had introduced Stephen Kilburn to Bud. Stephen was a quiet, reserved man in his late 20s at the time, and he approached Bud with something that he could not specifically put his finger on, but he remembered something may have happened to him during one of his long trips home late at night from his girlfriend's house. Something bothered him specifically about a stretch of road that he used to traverse coming home from her house in Maryland. And he had made an appointment to try hypnosis to see if there was anything that they could find that was to his seemingly unfound fear of that stretch of road. They got an appointment at the time with a skeptical hypnotherapist named Dr. Franklin, and Stephen would take Route 40 from 40 west from Baltimore to from Frederick to Baltimore. Under hypnosis, he remembered getting drowsy while driving, opening the window to freshen some air, and at some point he had bent down toward the dash of his car. He remembered the car was stopping, and then from then on he was confused about what had happened, and then he cried out in pain, saying that there was a clamp on his shoulder. At this point he remembered being out of the car, and he was frightened and could see at least 3 of them behind a 6-foot steel fence along the side of the road. He described a putty-looking, white-skinned, perfect-fingered being with no hair who climbed over the fence and approached him and was standing near him. And the session then was ended because of the obvious physical and psychological pain Stephen was encountering during the session. Now we're going to see reiterated time and again in our studies of the UFO phenomenon that similar images and description of humanoid beings with this white skin, this pale soft skin, plastic-like fingers, they keep showing up over and over. Steve's Maryland encounter happened in 1973. But let's look at some other cases that ended up backing up Stephen's case with similar instances of white-skinned beings and the putty-like skin, racer-like skin it was described as, and also subsequent plastic-like fingers or perfect fingers that are like tubes. One instance was November 1975, only 2 years later, and that was the famous Travis Walton case, where he was abducted and described his captors as being less than 5 feet tall. They had thin bones that were covered with what he described as marshmallow-looking skin, and the flesh that was marshmallow-looking and thin, round, perfect fingers. And then in October of the same year, 2 young men from Norway, Maine, had a similar encounter with those humanoid beings, and under hypnosis described their skin as really white, and that they looked like mushrooms. That was how they could come up with how to describe their skins look. Then in March of 1978, Bill Herman was abducted while observing a UFO outside his home in Charleston, South Carolina. He had been observing a UFO, and he described white skin that was like marshmallow. Also, earlier than that, in 1953, Jerry Armstrong, then only 12 years old, under hypnosis revealed his abductors as being white-skinned as well. Additionally, Air Force Sergeant Charles Moody described his August 1975 abductors with similar traits. He was quoted as saying their skin was almost like a mask. So, as we can see, this is a trend that has been developing since cases of UFO encounters and further abductions or potential abductions have been documented. Now there was a 7-month interim between the first hypnotic session in May with Dr. Franklin, and then finally a session could be scheduled December 1st with a Dr. Aphrodite Claymore. Now during the first half of the tape-recorded session of this hypnotic session, Stephen remembered that night driving along Route 40 in a little bit more detail. And he was able to retrieve the memory of driving fast being scared and having the feeling of somebody over his shoulder, like looking at him. And two white lights were seen in the rear view mirror. He switched on the dome light to see if they were still there, and this is now a little bit more that had come out, him describing why he had leaned forward toward the dash in the first hypnotic session. And it turned out that it was that he was trying to see those two white lights in the rearview mirror. And then he had turned off the dome light to see if they disappeared. They didn't. And he saw those two hazy white lights pass him by, and he felt the car swerve hard to the right, and it pulled off to the side of the road. Against his control, next he was outside the car looking at that same fence, curious and trying to see what was going on over there. His recollection resumed when he was driving in the car on his way back home. Now he kept repeating, "There's nothing to be afraid of, there's nothing to be afraid of." And it was almost as if that had been suggested to him in a nearly post-hypnotic suggestive manner, curiously. Now, the second side of the tape, when the recording resumed, he remembers being distinctly behind, seeing what he was trying to see happen behind the fence. And the area around him was bathed in bright light, intense light that he described as coming from behind him, but it was all around him. We're talking in the middle of the night here as well, so it was not daylight that it was happening. At least 3 humanoid beings came and surrounded him. Said one of them was the boss. And one of them was doing something behind him to the right. Whenever the one touched him, he said it hurt. And he recalls semi-shiny fingers, like tubes, that touched him, causing that pain. And the skin was whitish, like an artist's eraser, is how Stephen had described it. He remembered some sound and sight of dark arms and tight uniforms, and a noise like scraping leather against leather. Kind of curious. That sound, incidentally, was also mentioned, but not able to be placed in his first hypnotic session. Now the boss, the being that seemed like the boss, motioned behind him, being Stephen, and the smaller beings were less than his shoulder height, he describes them. One was digging a small hole in the side of the road, while others watched. And he was reluctant to allow further sight into the event, and it seemed that his hypnosis had stalled due to fear of progressing further in recalling the event. And so they ended the session at that time. You're getting a glimpse now, for those of you who haven't really read on the subject of UFOs and the abduction phenomenon, some common themes, some common threads, and some trends that have been observed and continue to be observed even. You've noticed the white skin, the tube-like fingers that seem almost repeatedly described as being plastic almost. No fingernails. We see a humanoid figure digging a little hole on the side of the road. Stephen had said that it was about 1 foot deep only. And that he was, some other supporting details is that the boss seemed like he was very, very thin, like he had no muscle structure. Stephen had estimated that if he had to take a guess, he would probably only be 50 pounds in weight. And that his head was abnormally large, his neck very skinny, like his biceps were not developed. Like very, very skinny. And his feet were almond-shaped, though he didn't know if they were boots or not. And when he walked very oddly, cumbersome-like, and would wobble from side to side, like he described him as perhaps having 2 bad knees, like an old man might do when he's walking. The other thing that's kind of interesting here that I'm just going to point out is it would appear that these beings are not perfect in their execution of their tasks, and that's evidenced by their difficulty in accomplishing things. Some of the other beings here seem to be clumsy as well. And these kind of phenomena are observed quite frequently. And not only that, but in the abduction cases, we're going to find that mistakes are made often. And we'll get to those eventually. But I just wanted to get your mind kind of thinking along those lines. We're not working with some kind of perfect deities for sure, and so that can be ruled out because, you know, there's many instances where imperfections are observed in their tasks and in their undertakings. Now, getting back to Chapter 3 of Missing Time, it was some months before Stephen was willing to even pursue the incident further. He was scared and did not want to look into the matter anymore at the time. And during that time, Ted told Bud of a California incident that had emerged dating November 26, 1972. And that had involved Judy Kendall and her sisters, Dannon and Becky. And it went about like this, where the girls had visited their grandmother in Bodega Bay and had left on a 2-hour trip back home. They arrived back home at midnight with 4 hours late, and at 4 hours of those late time is missing time block, unaccounted for. They did remember driving over the same bridge twice on the way home. And these kind of happenings, these kind of recollections are sometimes would key you into the fact that something was not right in their recollection. Or not even in the recollection necessarily, but in the incident particularly. After a series of events triggering bits of recalls of the events of that night, Judy was hypnotized and recounted an abduction event, again with white-skinned little beings. But she also reported seeing 3 distinctly different humanoids on board that UFO where she was abducted. One was a woman that looked entirely human. And now, even as early as the book Missing Time, where Bud is recounting incidents that he had been involved in, we're getting a little bit of snatches here and there, little pieces of information that we're gathering that we're going to see revisited in some of the other books that we're going to go into, some of the other material we're going to cover. And I want you to just make mental notes of these things because they are interesting. I believe that some of these interesting things, when a little flag is raised in your mind, there's something that could be to it. And when things are supported by other events, completely unrelated, one has to at least ponder the concept of something maybe worth investigating. Now, another 2 trends we're going to see that have emerged from the Kilbourne-Kendall cases, and that's that abductions occurred with no recollection of even seeing a UFO in both those cases initially, and also of cars that were being externally controlled out of the power of the operator. In both those cases that happened. Let's take a look at that in a little bit more detail. In the 1964 Barney and Betty Hill case, their car swerved off the road violently out of Barney's control at the time. 1978, there were 2 nurses in Tennessee that stopped at a red light when they looked up and saw a UFO which seemed to drag their car forward for some 500 feet before they came to a stop. 1975, Sandra Larson watched her car get levitated right up toward a UFO. Also, a witness in Alaska had their car forced to go for only 25 miles an hour for many miles, during which time it seemingly didn't expend any gasoline. And then on January 6th, 1976, the Casey County, Kentucky abduction, where the ladies saw some women saw the blue lights. They saw blue light, and they felt that their car was wildly going out of control at some 85 miles an hour, and they experienced burning sensations in their eyes, lots of pain, and then the violent feeling of being drawn backward, even though they were going 85 miles an hour forward. They reached home with 1.5 hours of missing time, and a subsequent abduction case was revealed. Now, getting back to Stephen Kilburn, during his 4th hypnotic session that was filmed by NBC, it didn't reveal a whole lot of new info that Ted and Bud hadn't already discovered, but it was interesting nonetheless. In that time, he described a ramp that led up into the UFO, and that the clamp shoved him forward that was on his shoulder and back. He ended up experiencing an examination. He was naked on a table. There was a probe with a needle that was run along his back, and also a cylindrical probe that with a blunt end that was used to press against his back multiple times. There was a device on his arm that was like a blunt rod, and it was lead in color, he described it. All sorts of procedures, including paralysis, numbness, pain, were inflicted upon Stephen Kilburn, causing his muscles to twitch, and on all kinds of parts of his body. Upon coming out of the hypnotic trance, a pressure in his ears, not unlike the sudden change in altitude of an aircraft. He experienced a phenomenon such as that, which had been at the time quite unusual, and it could only be alleviated by repeated yawning and swallowing. Folks, I'm here to say that these, you can't read everything that you can't believe everything that you read. And certainly the internet is not the source for all knowledge. And, a lot of people write a lot of things on the internet. I wouldn't say that they're all necessarily true, but I also necessarily wouldn't say they're all false. And that becomes the task of one as they try to surmise what is going on here. Is you have to try to sift the wheat from the chaff, so to say, and try to figure out what is believable, what is credible. And so that's part of the reason why it becomes very useful to have repeated incidents describing similar things, because they definitely back each other up, and it makes it it lends credibility to the instances. Now, to conclude for the time being our discussion of Stephen Kilburn, some 7 years after the incident, Bud was able to get Dr. Paul Cooper, then a young neurosurgeon, to give Stephen an examination. And during the 2.5-hour interview and exam, what did Dr. Cooper find out? He was amazed, because he said that Stephen was a bright young man, and he tried to mislead him in many of his descriptions of what had happened to him. Basically, he was trying to figure out what went on with all these probes and causing Stephen's muscles to jerk, and the paralysis and the sensations that he was describing. And it turned out that he couldn't ever lead him on, he couldn't mislead him, and medically speaking, Stephen didn't have the knowledge at the time to have been able to lie his way through an interview of that sort, nor the examination. And Dr. Paul Cooper couldn't make anything of. There was a small scar on next to his navel, but there was any numbers of things that could have caused that. And his conclusion was that he had undergone some sort of neurological testing. So, I want everybody out there to think these things through. And as you start gaining more knowledge of the UFO and alien abduction phenomenon, start thinking about correlation. Start thinking about what is believable and what might not be plausible. Look at what has multiple instances. We're going to look for trend analysis. And these trends become extremely important, because with people that are unassociated with each other, when they experience things that are almost identical or similar in nature, one has to wonder what is going on out there. Further in this chapter, Bud made an interesting point, and he had said that if 100 details happen during one of these abduction experiences, it would seem that about 80 of them are shared with other reported experiences, while 20 remain new. But certainly, one must look for the trend, and that's what we're going to do here. Well, stay safe out there, folks. This has been Joe Hero with another episode of Somewhere Out There.